right, last up, we've got Daisy Robinton, co-founder of Oviva Therapeutics, which actually sold a couple months ago. And Oviva is redefining how we treat and prevent ovarian aging, bridging reproductive biology and longevity science.
Hello, everybody. Do I have to use this? Can I stand here? That's better. I'm Daisy. It's such a pleasure to meet you all, and thank you for staying for the very last session. I know there's been a lot of information and content, and you're all baking and simmering in it, and I'm actually quite excited that we get to be last, so we can have that last word and be the last thing that you're really thinking about as you leave and are inspired and percolating on all these incredible ideas and conversations. And of course, thank you, Jordan and Kevin and John, for having us, and to the working group that enabled our panel to be here talking about what we're talking about. I'd love to tell you a little bit about Oviva and what I built and why, but I'm more excited to talk about the opportunities, AKA structural barriers, that companies like ours face and have faced and continue to face, and what the roadmap is to seeing more success and innovation reach the hands of patients and people in this space. I'm a molecular biologist by training. I did a PhD and a postdoc, really looking at the intersection of early developmental biology and aging and pathology. And when I was 31 years old, I went to a reproductive endocrinologist just to kind of figure out what my fertility journey might look like, and was horrified to learn that despite having a PhD in human biology and translational medicine, I was shockingly ignorant about my own body and physiology. And that sent me down a rabbit hole to better understand ovarian physiology and the science of female physiology. And I think Brittany will probably be pleased to learn that the thing that horrified me most was that when I went through menopause, my sex life would tank. So I was like, this cannot stand, I must do something. Literally, that was like one of the main drivers. I was like, I can't handle that for 40% of my life. So I went on this deep dive just to better understand what is it about the ovaries that support overall health and well-being. What can we do so that the second half of our lives can be as rich and vibrant and sexy as the first, well, maybe not the first half, but sexually active part, whatever. That got weird. So I ended up starting a company called Oviva Therapeutics in partnership with my co-founders, David Pepin and Pat Donahue from MGH and Harvard, who are two incredible, fabulous minds that built the foundation of the biology around the protein called AMH, which we heard a little bit about yesterday, currently used as a clinical biomarker to approximate ovarian reserve. Now, what's cool about AMH is it's actually a regulator of how quickly our eggs are lost throughout the course of our lifespan. So if you're a cycling woman before menopause, you're losing about 1,000 eggs per cycle. That's to ovulate one. So there's this enormous waste. We don't really understand why we want or need 1,000 eggs to be lost with every cycle, and AMH really controls if we have a high number or a low number of eggs that are being released every month to mature and potentially be the one that ovulates. So our thesis at Oviva was really, could we use this as a therapeutic strategy to reduce that number of eggs that were lost every month as a means to extend the runway of time that our ovaries are able to function before they then fail and go into menopause. So as Britt mentioned, we sold our company earlier this year to Granada Bio, so they've sort of carried the mantle. But I'll just say briefly, as a company that really built a framework around a single asset therapeutic strategy with a much broader potential and long-term goal for how we're going to improve health span in women, we really struggled in the awful market that has preceded, the last couple of years to find investors that were willing to take that risk and carry forward the incredible science we had to see the fruition that is possible. And in many ways, that's actually what led us to sell the company, is because it's able to be, the risk is able to be borne by a different structure, somebody that has a diversified portfolio. It just wasn't going to work as a single asset play. And there's a lot of companies in the women's health space that suffer from this because they have this really deep focus. They're trying to solve the problem, and you have to do that with really high specificity because the complexity is already so enormous that when you start broadening too much, you really lose your ability to be effective. And so we start getting into some of the reasons that we see failures in this place. There's 5 that I really want to talk about. The first is funding, which I won't belabor because everybody talks about it and it's a little bit boring. But I'll just say briefly that we are seeing improvements in funding for women's health, but we're still seeing a failure at the growth stage. So a lot more capital is going in for these early stages, seed and pre-seed, even Series A, and we're not seeing that convert at Series B, in large part because of the broader the broader structural needs that are enabling scaling. So the second is diagnosis, and this goes to Roma's points around data. We don't have the data, And paired with that, we don't actually have the language. So we don't really understand how to talk about many of the conditions in women's health, much less at the biological level, what's really happening and how to diagnose and treat those. And without diagnosis, we can't have ICD codes. So this is another enormous barrier for anybody, especially in the therapeutic space. If there's not an ICD code, there's not a mechanism for reimbursement. So who's paying for that? That's why we often go direct to consumer and why there's a lot more direct to consumer plays coming out. But again, this gets to the scale program. If we're gonna solve for the female population in the country and on the earth, we really need to solve this problem. Next is the adoption and reimbursement. We talked a lot, I think, yesterday about adoption and clinical training for OBGYNs and other physicians and how to get them up to speed on managing and understanding female physiology, but we also have a huge reticence to adoption for technologies and therapeutics in women's health, in large part because the clinical practices that focus in women's health tend to be the most financially stressed and the least incentivized to adopt something new, certainly if there's not strong reimbursement. So these are some of the pillars of structural barriers that I think are really flagged and important for companies in our space and for people that are interested in supporting companies in these space to really have an eye on and a plan for in order for there to be a path to success. Now, what I'm really excited about with all of these is that you cannot be successful as a company in women's health without having an eye on these. And at the same time, these problems aren't necessarily unique to women's health. They're problems that exist, at least in the United States, broadly. And as we all know, our healthcare system delivers some of the poorest value among our peer groups globally. We're spending $5 trillion a year for national health expenditures. And that's to get 4 years lower life expectancy than our peer countries. And 20% of our GDP for having increased maternal mortality rates, infant mortality, high burdens of chronic disease, to name just a few. And so we all know that there's reform that's needed. And I think what's exciting to me is that women's health companies are really poised to be the leaders of this charge because we already have to be thinking about that. If you don't have a plan in that, you're not going to be successful. And I think generally speaking, we need reform, and so we need that radical transformation to be brought forward by some of these companies that are thinking about how to innovate broadly as well as innovate technologically in the lanes that we're in. So just a few ideas to see this. I ran out of time, I'm sorry. I'll take 30 more seconds. Just a few ideas to see this discussion and get everybody here thinking. One of the things that we need to be doing is generating the regulatory and adoption pathways. So thinking from the regulatory standpoint, but also the clinician training. Reform the reimbursement, so generating pilot ICD codes so that we can actually incentivize the adoption of and pay for these new innovations. Expanding the FDA flexibility for technology in the women's health space, and I know that's something that there's at least been conversation around and interest in for the last couple of years, at least in some of the interactions I've had with the FDA and in rooms that I've been in with folks from the FDA. And just an acknowledgement that this solution is very complex and multifaceted. It requires everybody in this room and all of the health equity stakeholders to have a hand in. That's gonna be the innovators, that's gonna be the government, that's gonna be the patients and the providers. And so I do think an enormous part of the ask is really bringing this awareness forward, because certainly when I started in this field many years ago, I did not have, none of this was visible to me. I just thought, oh, there's unmet need and really amazing, strong science. Of course this can work. How naive, right? That's just not true. This is not driven by unmet need. Our field is not driven by unmet need. It's driven by the market and the structures. So that's what we need to change, and I think it's an invitation for our companies to lead that charge. Thank you.